Embedded in the Judeo-Christian tradition is that these things are exercised within the context of family and for the benefit of family and building community. The Old Testament community, which forms the basis of our religious beliefs primarily here in Barbados, sets out the foundation for the exercise of reproductive rights within the story of Genesis chapter 1 in creation, where God simply gives man the freedom to be fruitful and multiply. But Genesis 2 reins it in a little bit to remind us, okay, it's good to be fruitful and multiply, but it takes place within a context. It takes place within the context of the family with the purpose of building the community. And thus set the pattern for the population policy of the Old Testament community, because the Old Testament community is one built on a relationship with God, which they call the covenant. And the covenant had two strands. One, if they were faithful, God will give them a piece of land, but it also came with population growth. I'll make you a great nation, greater than the number of the grain of sand on the seashore and the stars in the sky. And therefore, within the context of covenant in the Old Testament, you therefore had to have the protection of sexual reproductive rights and freedoms. They had to be controlled. And they became controlled in the sense that women did not necessarily have the freedom to exercise those rights as they wished, because women were chattel. They were the properties of their father, who would later sell them to their husbands, and then they became the property of their husbands. So their reproductive rights were constrained within that relationship. But in addition to that, it also had implications for the man, because since their population policy is based on a relationship with Yahweh, the man does not have a right over his own body in terms of how he uses his reproductive matter either, because the seed is really Yahweh's seed and not the individual's. And that's where a lot of the laws in the Old Testament are premised. That law that people like to quote from Leviticus 18 and verse 22, a man shall not lie with a man, it's not necessarily about what we think it's about. It's about the wastage of seed, that you cannot engage in a practice that wastes Yahweh's seed because it's not yours. And that's why there's no law, no corresponding law about two women lying together, because as far as they're concerned, they can't do much. They're still the properties of their father. They have to, when the father is ready, he sells you and you make sure you get some children. That was their law. Likewise, the sin of onanism in Genesis 38, where they developed the whole notion of the Levirate marriage, where if your older brother died and he had no children, his brother after him should come and have a child with the woman so that the brother's name will not be blotted out in Israel. And Onan, the son of Judah, refused to perform that rite for his sister-in-law Tamar. Every time he laid with her, he would engage in what you call coitus interruptus and allow the seed to fall to the ground, and God slew him. Because again, it is not yours to waste. It is Yahweh's. So the whole reproductive policy in the Old Testament community was based on this covenant relationship. And this covenant relationship was lived out within the context of family and the building of community. So sexual reproductive rights, yes, you're an individual, but the individual was responsible to the community in terms of reproduction. The New Testament community is somewhat different, because their notion of covenant is not based on building a physical nation. And so their whole concept is different. But in the New Testament community, intercourse was to be for only one purpose, and that is reproduction. There's this thing about having fun and all that. It was not for that. It was about reproduction and production of children. And that's why in the early church, women beyond the age of childbearing could not marry. They were not allowed to get married because, as Basil the Great said, if a man marries such a woman, it's like plowing rocky soil. You won't be able to produce anything, and the whole thing was about reproduction. I have laid that foundation, sir, just to make the point that that particular community had its own policy about building its population, and it was within the context of an understanding that intercourse and reproduction is sacred, and it is premised upon your relationship with Yahweh. Fast forward to our time, we came up in a Judeo-Christian community, but our circumstances and our culture is totally different now. There's no way we can go and tell a young woman that she does not have agency over her own body, and that, I mean, you could try, as the dynamics of the biblical community would have been. But that notwithstanding, we know that in our past, there were people, we have a culture of very large families. In fact, I attended a function the other day where a young woman at 90 was one of 11, and that was the nature of Barbadian families. But then we have to take into account our development as a people. I can remember one Calypsonian who was very popular, singing sometime back in the 80s, "Thou shalt not kill." It's against the abortion bill. "In the name of the Lord, don't fear the maternity ward." I got that right, sir? Johnny, my boy, went back in the 1980s, huh? We also have a culture, because women have agency over their bodies, they can also make choices about their sexual reproductive rights. And we know in Barbados that there is space for legal abortions and so on. And so we have to take that into consideration when we talk about our population policy. In fact, just in 2023, Barbados had just about over 400 abortions. So when we multiply that, when we take that throughout the years, we can see that that may have contributed in some way to the population crisis that we have at this point in time. But I just want to commend the drafters of this policy. It is wide-ranging, it is comprehensive, and it shows that a great deal of thought went into it, particularly in the areas of the goals. With our first goal, which deals with citizenship, expanding the scope of citizenship and migration and so on, that speaks to the need to, the urgency with which we need to grow our population. But I also want to add the caution that Senator Walters would have added, because let us not forget that the most recent election in the US, one of the most important issues was immigration. And what immigration speaks to is not just that you don't want people in, but the question is, how will these people alter the culture and the dynamic of your society? And it came with a bit of fear, as we would have expected, and we saw the results of that. So we too have to be very careful. I mean, we know only too well how Barbadians felt just maybe over a decade ago or so, when we had a certain group of people here in large numbers, and then there were some very derogatory things being said about them. They were treated in ways that you would not want Barbadians to be treated if they had to go anywhere, you see. So we have to be cognizant of that when we deal with migration. And I have no doubt that whichever administration will be in power at the time, that we in Barbados have the ability to manage this in a way that will see after the needs of everyone. So I understand that particular area. What I'm really impressed about is the sub-goal 1.2, which speaks to enhancing family well-being to support reproductive and decision-making. I think this is a very important area for us, because one of the things I've been very concerned about, even though I have not had a study on it, just dealing with anecdotal matters, the seemingly anti-family approach of some of our businesses in this country, where young women feel that they cannot express their fecundity, they cannot express their sexual rights and reproduce because of the negatives that it will bring in terms of their promotion and upward mobility in the company. I think we need to deal with that. Even if it's just one instance, it's one instance too many. Because we cannot build the type of society we want where women are fearful or feel that they cannot have a child at this point in time because they cannot progress in life. Having a family and having children should become a celebrated thing in our society. It is something that we should cherish. We should be happy when women have children and encourage them to have children and encourage them to build families. But if we're having companies that will punish, and I'm saying punish here in inverted commas, a woman simply because she's pregnant and she has to be out for a few months or whatever to make sure the child is properly weaned, then that is not the type of society we want to build in Barbados, you know. And so I call for us to become a more family-friendly country where people are encouraged. I am happy to see that there are, well, there's a point towards the possibility of incentives for having a family. And I know this is something that other nations have tried and were successful at. In fact, I happened to be in the United Kingdom in the year 2017 when they put a cap on the benefits for the number of children you have. And they put the cap that we'll stop at 2 children. If you go beyond that, so yeah, we'll stop at 2 children. If you go beyond that, that's at you. I always remember the morning I went to Mass in church, and the priest, obviously, he had a couple of children because he was livid. He couldn't believe how the government could just change this bill like this and put people in the jeopardy that they would have been in. So they too had incentives for having children to help to grow their nation. And having children is not just about creating statistics. It's about creating families. It's about extending the culture of the country. And so these are things that I'm happy to see that we have here in this bill. We need to create more family-friendly workspaces, as has been pointed out, so that we have daycares that are close to work centers, etc., to encourage people that it is okay to have your children, it is okay to have them here. Of course, all of this comes with dealing with other issues, because this population policy then has to touch areas like cost of living and all the other things that we have to deal with. So it's a holistic approach that we must have to national development. And as Senator Walters rightly said, and Senator Blackman, it is coming at the right time. We're on the cusp of celebrating yet another year of self-governance and self-determination. And these are the types of issues that should occupy our mind and our time at this point in time. What is also commendable in this particular resolution is the attention being paid to health care and care of the elderly. I think we've debated this so many times that I need not rehash it, but just to say, remember that we are an aging population. I just did some statistical studies for my deanery in the church, and one of the things that I recognize is that in our census of 2010, the Anglicans in Barbados, 44% of the Anglicans were over the age of 50. And so our population, our congregations are the ones that we're speaking about here in terms of health care. And so as a church, we have to look at how we will seek to provide facilities and so on to care for our members, but we want to encourage the rest of the population to do the same. And I'm very happy that this has been placed here in this population policy, because it's not just about growing the population, it's about caring. It's about providing an environment where we're living as a family and as a community. I've often said that we chide people, and I'm not making anyone heroes here, but some of the people who go and leave their elderly at the hospital, you know, we may be angry with them and we look down on them, but in some cases, that is an act of love. Because many of them recognize they do not have the means to care for their loved ones. Many of them recognize that I can't stay home any longer. And so the best thing to do with mommy or daddy is to put them somewhere where at least somebody will care for them. So we have to be empathetic when those things happen as well. And so I think that the focus here in this policy ought to jolt us as a nation to realize this is an area we need to pay more attention to, because many a young person has had to forfeit his or her personal development for the love of mom or dad. And there's nothing wrong with borrowing from other places, but I see a policy in the United States now where you're actually being paid to stay at home and care for your elderly. I don't know where we'll get the resources to do that, but I think that that's a good policy as well. So these are things that we can look at. And just as important, the policy also touches the environment. And in touching the environment, it raises the issue of balance. Yes, we want to get a larger workforce so that persons can contribute. But we also have to do that against the availability of resources. And one of the things we must be cognizant of is that Barbados is a water-scarce country. And so we have to now balance how we're going to maintain adequate levels of all our natural resources while trying to get this population at a level that can be productive. And so, having said all of that, I want to commend the drafters of the policy, but also to remind us, on this, the cusp of our independence, and I'm speaking through you, sir, to persons out there. It was Barrington Levy who said, to all the rude boys, it's time to put down your weapons. Because the problems we have with our population, look at how many young people we're losing. The flower of Barbadian youth. The ones who should be reproducing the great nation. These are the people that are being lost every day in some of the most heinous ways. You know, and so I want to call us as a nation to a moment of reflection. We can't continue like this. I've said this before, we just can't. Too many of our young people are being lost. And through nonsense. I believe that this policy, this population policy, is calling us as a nation to look at ourselves and ask ourselves, as former Prime Minister and now national hero would have asked, what is our mirror image? Is it the same thing as it was way back in the 1960s when we started this journey? Do we have that same passion? Do we still have that willingness to go beyond the call of duty because our nation needs us? Or have we become so individualistic in our reproductive choices, in our work life, in our community life, in everything, so that we no longer think about community, but we think about self? If we're going to reshape this nation and guide it to attain the greatness for which it was destined, it requires all of us to recognize that we have a critical role to play in national development. For the young people out there who are looking at life and think that I do not need any children, I don't want any children, I hate them, because many young people tell you that. I do not want any children, they're too noisy. I would say, but somebody endured your noise. Somebody cared for you. And maybe it comes from the sense of community that we've created or lack thereof. But I want to encourage us to build a new Barbados. And the new Barbados may not look like the one that we had before. It may mean that we may have a larger migrant population. The culture may be shaped in a little different way, but there are some core things that we can hold on to, which is the genuine care for the other, decency, a sense of national pride, and faith. I think a lot of people discount the importance of faith in building what we have as a nation now. The church of which I'm a part came to this country just under 400 years ago with the first settlers. It had a checkered past. A lot of negative things were done in its name, but also a lot of positive things. It helped to shape the community. It helped to shape what became our culture. And whether we recognized it or not, an integral part of Barbadian culture was our faith. Church and Sunday was sacred. You do not play any banjo on Sunday. And I remember when I came back here in 1987, sir, one of the things that shocked me was how, as soon as Ash Wednesday came, the whole tone of every radio station changed. The music was solemn. Everything was respected. But then I began to see the changes. I believe it was 1989 when we had our first Good Friday Fete. I can hear it being advertised still. Yeah, Sunday used to be a rest day on test matches too. So, and everything just changed. The whole culture changed. And it reached a height a few weeks ago, sir, when I was preparing to go down for my 6 a.m. mass. And around 5 o'clock, I heard all this commotion in the community. Noise, blaring, jam music. And I said, on Sunday morning, what's happening? This nightclub like it forgot to close. I went to church because my wife warned me, you make sure you go straight to church. Don't go play you looking for nobody to. I wasn't going anywhere. Only to find out that some of my members said when they were coming, the street was blocked because there was a street jam. On Sunday morning. Maybe they were Adventists. I don't, no, they were not Adventists. Sorry, my Adventist friends. They were not Adventists. And I know they were not Adventists because when I came out of church at 7, I was going to another church, and I saw how they were dressed, and they were definitely not Adventists. They were adventurers, or adventurous. I've just said that to say that a lot has changed. And we have to start building community again. And we have to build community around faith, which is grounded in family life, as the building blocks of our community. So once again, I wish to commend the government and commend the drafters of this policy and fully support the proposals that have been set here. It's for us now to put things into action. So I thank you very much for the time, sir.
Thank you, Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers. Any more speakers?
You speaking?
Senator Andrew Du Bois.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. Given the late hour, I will try not to be as expansive as I had intended to sort of be. Mr. President, as I was reading this national policy, I thought to myself, if you had asked the average Barbadian 6 or 7 years ago what some of the most pressing challenges that face them were, I'm not sure that the multiple and interrelated challenges of population would feature prominently on that list. That notwithstanding, the government of Barbados had the foresight to craft the document that is now before us, and more particularly to recognize that if these challenges and issues went unaddressed, that they had the capacity to impact, to compromise what we take this country to be and what we hope that it will continue to be. And so it is in that context that I wish to add my voice to the commendations for the commissioners who I think have done generational work both in scope and in impact. Sir, I have to admit that I entirely enjoyed reading this national policy because I think bound up in this population policy are achievements of this country, achievements of this administration, aspirations of this country, and aspirations of this administration. And then there are some truths with which we must grapple. And so as I went through the policy, sir, you saw the Barbados that you hoped would take shape, the Barbados that is in the midst of becoming also take shape, Mr. President. I will focus my comments, Mr. President, almost exclusively on the building of the care economy, because that is an essential tenet of this national policy. I say I enjoyed reading the document, sir, and one of those reasons specifically was that as I was reading the document, there was a cohesion of policy from this document to much of the work that the government of Barbados is currently engaged in. I specifically refer, sir, to things like the care of the elderly. Barbados has, in the last few years, made significant investment in the care of the elderly, in the construction of the geriatric hospital, in the crafting of a community elder care program, and in the contemplation in the future construction of respite centers. And no doubt, sir, this comes at a time when many Barbadians are grappling with the realities of care. Grappling with the realities of how to balance those care responsibilities with professional responsibilities. And trying to make good on what we take to be the moral imperative of caring for generations that cared for us, while also being productive citizens and workers. I use that example to talk about the elderly, but that is also true for persons with disabilities. As you know, sir, I was a member of the Committee for Improving the Lives of Persons with Disabilities, and I say all the time that one of the more searing memories of the last few years sitting on that committee was one night at the Dighton Griffith School in consultation with a group of mostly women, mostly mothers of autistic children, and hearing them share their stories around how they balance caring for their child in many instances where they don't have a support system, in many instances where the fathers are not there, and balancing that responsibility with their professional responsibilities. Suffice it to say, sir, I'm almost compelled to also quote popular culture and say that it is not an easy road for them. Many of those women, Mr. President, shared the stories of trying to get their child ready in the morning and enduring what in any other context would be considered abuse and assault. But having to go out, after that experience, having to go out into the world and be productive. It is not an easy road. And it is why the government of Barbados has recently contemplated, you heard the Honorable Prime Minister speak to it as the lower chamber debated the national policy on disability, the crafting of the establishment of respite centers also for persons with disabilities. Sir, and then there is, of course, the policy also contemplates incentives and tax benefits for persons across various sectors. Also in the area of disability, Mr. President, coming out of the last estimates and budget process, we know that there was an expansion of the disability benefit to 4 new categories of persons with disabilities. A recognition that care costs and that a person caring for certainly particular categories of persons with disabilities, depending on the severity, may from time to time be compromised in their economic standing, to put it as charitably as I can. And so those are the investments that the government of Barbados is making around our care economy. I want to join the Honourable Senator, Reverend Dr. John Rogers, Cannon, my apologies, when he says that our businesses, our private sector, need to create a better culture, more inclusive culture for families. Mr. President, I chuckle all the time at the notion that during COVID, we mastered the art, those of us who could, of working from home. And it was just the way things were. In the period since, though, there has been a call to come back to the office, a call to come back to whatever your quarters may be. And as we contemplate building up care infrastructure, as we contemplate, Mr. President, creating systems that permit people the space to care for their elderly, for their disabled, for their children, Mr. President, we may need to re-inspire the collective imagination that led us to work from home and think again, to look again at the allowances that we created at that time, sir. Because I think that no doubt, I think the data tells us that productivity did not suffer any large degree because we were working from our studies or kitchen tables. And perhaps we need to think again and to, I think, do the right thing in relation to permitting people the space to do that which they need to do. Mr. President, there have also been investments, as you know, in child protection and in child justice, sir. And bound up in those policies are also notions of family and the stability of our family. Those reforms to the legislative system are really aimed at ensuring the stability of our familial relations as best we can, even when things go wrong. And I think that those are also investments in care and in people, Mr. President, necessary investments in people, and the government of Barbados ought to be commended for those efforts, but also for the policy cohesion that we see and the through line that we see running through both this document and so much else that the government is doing and contemplating at this moment. Because very often, those of us in the social policy space will complain about policy isolation, right? Where a government commits to doing population, to meeting a set of population targets, but you only see those ambitions reflected in population policy. Not so with this administration, because policy by policy, legislation by legislation, you're seeing a commitment to care that runs through so much of the work that the government is doing. Mr. President, I said I don't intend to be long, and so there are Perhaps only two other submissions that I would wish to make in relation to this issue. The policy also contemplates, Mr. President, access to health care. And we heard just a moment ago reflections on sexual and reproductive health and the ways in which we need to improve our appreciation of sexual and reproductive health, Mr. President. Let me say this. We have had a culture in this country of silence in relation to sexual and reproductive health. And if any of this policy is going to make any sense, certainly the tenets around sexual and reproductive health, we are going to have to change that. We're going to have to shift away from that, Mr. President. And that is going to require a number of things. One of them, in my view, is age-appropriate, comprehensive sexuality education. And I know when you say that, sometimes it inspires some angst. I hope that I will get some reprieve on this, the eve of independence. Sir, comprehensive sexuality education, life skills education should run through all of the nation's institutions, the church, the school, our social groups and social clubs, Mr. President. And very often when we talk about comprehensive education, sexuality education, we talk almost exclusively about children, right? Because that is the thing that is sexy, for want of a better term. It inspires, angst. But I think no doubt, sir, that it is essential for it to run through all of our institutions and for it to be happening across the lifespan and life cycle. The data tells us that there are information deficits throughout the life cycle, right? The ignorance, in the proper use of that term, that a child or an adolescent may have does not disappear when they become 18 or 21, Mr. President. And so I think there has to be space across our institutions to talk about these issues, to confront them. I think there is space, no doubt, for, as we grapple with things like STIs, but also as we grapple with things like gender-based violence. Quite ironically, or entirely by happenstance, we're having this conversation in the midst of the 16 days of activism to end gender-based violence. And what if our institutions were better at having these conversations with not only women, but men as well, with a view to cauterizing the unmentionables. I said before that there's so much that we don't talk about, yes? And what if we reimagined institutions, schools and churches and community groups in a way that permitted space for these kinds of conversations? I think the time is now, Mr. President. Sir, the other issue, the other truth that I think that we have to tell ourselves is that there is work attached to the silence to which I referred. There is work that we have to do in the legislative and policy space. I think for far too long, Mr. President, Barbados has permitted what SRH advocates refer to as that 16-18 disparity. The difference between the age of consent and the age of medical independence. Suffice it to say, Mr. President, that I think that we need to apply our collective imagination to solving it. There is no room in a Barbados that is about to celebrate its 58th anniversary for that kind of ignorance in the proper use of the term. The idea, sir, that an adolescent at 16 can consent to sexual activity, but is precluded from independently seeking medical attention is it is literally a nonsense. Mr. President, this House, this chamber, and the government of Barbados has benefited extensively in recent years from the work of the Law Reform Commission. And I think that that commission would be well placed, certainly in my view, to grappling with these issues and to, in furtherance of this national policy on disability, fixing these issues. Sir, there is one more issue, one more truth, and then I'll take my seat. And it is the issue of access to SRH for members of the disabled community. Sexual and reproductive health, information and education and access for members of the disabled community. Mr. President, the prevailing sentiment in this country, even sometimes held by medical practitioners and doctors and nurses and others, is that members of the community should not have access to their sexual and reproductive rights. And we do this, the stories, I refer to being a member of the Committee for Improving the Lives of Persons with Disabilities, the women and sometimes men who told us stories of interfacing with doctors in both the public and private sector and hearing, why are you here? Pregnant women, so what you gonna do with this child now? What you gonna do this for? It is something that we need to apply our best efforts to stopping, Mr. President. When we talk about access to our public facilities and to public services, we often think about the physical environment, right? Like, do you have a ramp? Do you have an accessible bathroom? But our conception of access also has to meet the issues of training, and it also has to meet the issues of perceptions and stereotypes, Mr. President, with a view to making those spaces as accessible as possible. In addition to that, I will make a call for things like the training of medical professionals in things like sign language. Because imagine going into a clinic with the intention or the need to speak to a medical professional about, you know, your innermost activity, if you will, and there's a language barrier, yeah? Or you have to take someone with you who you may not wish to take in other circumstances to explain, to interpret, rather. Mr. President, these are the conversations that we need to have to breathe life, to breathe more life into this population policy. I commend the government of Barbados for its foresight. I commend the government of Barbados for its foresight. I commit, Mr. President, celebrate a Barbados on the eve of its independence that is doing and committed to doing this generational work. And may we continue that work, and may we always find the moral courage to tell ourselves the difficult truths. Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Andrew Boyce. Senator Blackman.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I rise to wrap up this debate on the resolution of the population policy. And I would wish to commend everyone who took the floor and spoke on a matter of significant importance to Barbados. And as you've heard, this discussion and debate took place within the context of the future of the country, our population needs, but as has also come out, and as also has been suggested, not just the socio and economic aspect of it, but also the focus on how can we ensure that the livelihoods of our nation and our citizens and residents takes place in a holistic way going forward. And it allows me to express gratitude for the contributions. I also want to make note of Senator Walters' remarks. We often, more often than not, we don't agree on policy matters, but this afternoon, no, but hold on. But this afternoon, I heard from him, perhaps for the first time, and I suspect as he charts out his path within his own party, it was a reflection of things to come. And therefore, he gave us a new flavor and not the usual script that he was given to him. And therefore, I welcome that sort of debate from the honourable member, because I believe that in time to come, we will see a new dawn. But let me also pay homage to, or I can only be me. Let me also pay homage to Reverend Dr. Canon Rogers for his intervention, and also placing squarely some of the societal perspectives that we must confront as we treat the population, as we treat to our women, as we treat to our society, and a lot of the vulnerabilities that oftentimes go unchecked, or not necessarily unnoticed, but not given necessarily the spotlight in which they need. And in his usual eloquence, he charted, in my view, a framework for consideration also on the eve of our independence. And to my fellow government senator, Senator Boyce, for capturing perfectly some of the challenges, but equally opportunities he's outlined for consideration for those amongst us who are not just vulnerable, but really looking at how can we treat to a lot of the gaps that are filled when it looks to the issues to sexual reproductive health. And therefore, Mr. President, I just want to take this opportunity to wish fellow Barbadians a happy independence, a happy Republic Day tomorrow. And once again to wish Shirley Chisholm a centenary happy birthday. And as we look to build up this population, as we look to build up this country, that we can continue to see the gains and growth and stability that we've enjoyed, underscored by a population that punches above its weight here and abroad and wherever we go. And Mr. President, I'd like to beg that this resolution be now passed.
The question is that this resolution, the Parliament of Barbados take note of the Barbados Population Policy 2023, do no pass. Those honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it. This resolution is therefore passed.
Order number 7, sir. Name of the Honourable Leader in the Senate to move the second reading of this Sexual Offences Bill 2024.
Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. The hour is late, and I know it's the night before Independence Day, and it's coming up to the Christmas season, and I've already been threatened by at least one colleague that I am going to be on their Grinch list. But I have given them the assurance that I want to make sure that I'm not on their Grinch list by not keeping us here at Christmas by making us suffer through on a night like tonight. So bear with me, guys. So, colleagues, I rise on this occasion to take us through the sexual offences bill, which is before us, the amendments which are there. I'm not going to go into a lengthy discourse on the bill. I believe that the bill has been on the order paper in the other place and in this one for some time, and so I'm confident that honourable members have had an opportunity to peruse the substance of the bill. Simply put, Mr. President, this is an old piece of legislation, but not as old as some of the others. 1992 was when it first came into effect, but it was a case that was held far more recently that caused one particular section to be called into question. Section 12 of the existing legislation
Senator Morris, just be a little more quiet. Okay, I can hear you up here. I know you weren't speaking loudly, you just have a voice that flows so smoothly through the ear. Continue, Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. No, there was a case that was brought before the courts in Barbados, and there was a question of the constitutionality of a particular section of the bill. While the government did not attempt to appeal the ruling, there was one section of it that the government felt was inadvertently spoken to, and as a result, these amendments arise here today. The situation that the government found itself was that, as it stood, without any action on the part of the government, while it would have taken one particular section of the legislation out of operation, it, however, did not put the government in a position where certain types of activity, in particular with children under the age of 16, could be treated to in the way in which we would expect it needed to be. And so the amendments are being brought, and you will hear another presentation that will go into the legal details of that very shortly. But the amendment is being made to ensure that the relevant protections are there for persons under 16. But in amending the legislation, the legal team led by the Attorney General took the opportunity to go a little bit further and to address a number of items. It addressed in particular then in new sections of the legislation items relating to persons who, for example, were being termed in the previous legislation an idiot, an imbecile, or mentally subnormal. Those are not words that are part of our vernacular, and certainly if we heard Senator Andrele Boy speaking in previous debates or even in an earlier discussion, the way in which we treat to persons and the way we speak to our people is not going to be reflected in words such as this. It was found that these words were offensive and the opportunity was taken to remove them. There was also, Mr. President, a new element which was included that was not there, and certainly for those of us with children, nieces, nephews, neighbors, the question of grooming, men, women, seeing young children, encouraging them with sweets, with enticements of different sorts, flattery, bringing them into their confidence and appearing to show them love and attention, affection, only for the purpose of preparing them for sexual exploitation. The term grooming has now been inserted into the legislation as we have made these changes. And so these are some of the new elements which were not there. So this modernizes the legislation as it relates to sexual offenses. But it also then goes on, Mr. President, to speak to the persons with some kind of mental or physical disorder where those persons cannot understand the nature of the act being done to them, or they can't decide whether the act should take place or not, whether they want to engage in it or not. And so these are the elements that have been included in the new legislation. And so on that basis, Mr. President, in a very, perhaps my shortest presentation to this chamber, out of deference to my honorable colleagues, this is the matter for the consideration of the chamber, and I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Senator Warrell.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I rise to make a contribution to the amendment to the Sexual Offences Act. And at this late hour, I will try to be as concise as possible. I really should be, at this time, rapping conkeys and stuff like that, but... But anyhow, I will try to make my contribution. Now, and more so not necessarily on the issues in the amendment, some of which are very important, but in this week or last week, we received a report that from Dr. Tanya, a lecturer at the University of the West Indies, right, with Barbados being one of the 4 countries globally with the highest incidence of rape. This was said by the head of the Institute of Gender Development at the University of the West Indies. And in particular, you have sexual violence in terms of partner relationships. So this it brings the importance of this legislation, and hopefully for us to have a debate on what is actually happening within our country. And there are certain aspects of the bill that I wanted to speak to in terms of, well, there's the Me Too movement, which is going on across the world. And you know that the Democratic Labour Party introduced the Sexual Harassment in the Workplace Act in 2017, where when we introduced that act, there was a period of consultation where the human resource departments of most organizations were challenged to give examples of things which could be considered as sexual harassment in the workplace. And I think that at this time, we really need to enforce within the country a better understanding of the way how to treat persons in terms of relationships. We also have the issues with gender, domestic violence as well. And these are things that we need to consider and speak to as in this chamber, not on a political basis, but in terms of getting the country back to the standard and the values that we need to see, especially coming on the backdrop of the population resolution which we just did. It does not make sense expanding the population, but you are not setting guidelines as to the values that you would want for our citizens to uphold and to maintain. So this gives us an opportunity to speak to that in this, in this debate tonight. Now, in Barbados, I'm trying not to say culture, because I would never want it to be part of our culture. But there is a bad habit which is growing in popularity. You see the vulgarity in the music. You see the vulgarity as well in the videos coming from the entertainment events. All of these things create a mindset that you can do whatever you want with your sexual partner or someone in a relationship with. The language in the music is not very positive and not very influential, and these are things that we need to educate our people. And I will go back to education is very important. That is why we need to make sure that our school system is inculcating the right values and teaching our children in the right way, because to make them model citizens of this country and the behavior that we expect from them. You can't say one thing and then do another. You can't say that you condemn lewd sexual behavior, but then you promote it at a fete, or even politicians are guilty of it too, promote it at political events sponsored by political parties as well. You need to set some standard in which persons, especially young people looking at you, can know what behavior is accepted and allowed within the society. And this is where I would want to focus my contribution on in this debate. I also go to the fact too, with regard to grooming, as mentioned by Senator Cummings. It is a problem. It is a problem. And it is a problem that is also being accepted by some parents because of the social, economic situation in the country. And these are things that need to be ruled out. And I am hoping that we put the legislation here, that we enforce it. And the agencies which are responsible for enforcing it, such as the Child Care Board, are given the power to go out there and actually address these issues. Because, to be real, you have situations in Barbados where not only young girls, but also the young men as well, parents may not necessarily have the funds to send them to school, or there may be a need to pay a bill in the house. And there's someone lying around the household or within the community that would be willing to do right. And we need to stop these things. And we need to empower our agencies, the Child Care Board, the police, the Ministry of Education, where it is happening. You need social workers inside of the schools so that the children will be able to tell their story, and you can address it and correct it quickly before it becomes a problem, before it becomes a national disgrace. You need those things happening within our society. We cannot continue to accept them, and then it becomes the norm. We need to stop it, because you need to protect our children. You need to protect our women in our communities. You need to protect persons with disabilities. You need to protect the persons who are vulnerable. These are things that we need to speak about in this chamber and be on one ground, united against these things. So So I would speak to that with regard to the grooming aspect of it. I have to raise two issues in terms of inconsistencies within the legislation. I told Senator Nichols that I would give him something to speak about, so he may want to come after me. But yes, the amendment, but it's not controversial. It's not controversial. It's nothing, so you don't go for your red book. Right. It is probably something to look at in the future. Now, the legislation does change the age of a minor to 16, okay? But, and then the second part of the legislation, it had originally the age of criminal responsibility for rape, in this case, was 14, which was then changed to 16. But I believe this administration recently passed the Child Justice Act, where the age of criminal responsibility was moved down to 12. So there's a little bit of inconsistency in the policy. So this may be something that you may need to address, because in this legislation, you're saying that a person under the age of 16 cannot be criminally liable for rape. But then in the Child Justice Act, you're saying that the age of criminal responsibility is as low as 12. So you may want to consider some consistency and either raising the age in one or lowering it in the other. And for that, you may want to consider the child psychologist as well, to determine the mental and emotional development state of the difference between the mental and emotional development state of a child at 12 and a child at 16, and whether or not a child at 12 may be capable of raping someone and should not be held criminally liable for that rape. That is the one inconsistency, and I'm certain that Senator Nichols can address it as well. We don't go too much further. There is only one glaring difference in that the term, using the term spouse with regard to the marital relationships, well, sex within a marital relationship. You have now taken away the normal definition which was there in the previous act, where you define a marital relationship as between a man and a woman. And, right, I understand that you want to be able to say that the man or the woman could perform the act of rape in the relationship. I understand that that is part of it as well. But I would think, though, that you would need a better explanation, or maybe it could have been worded a different way in just using that gender-neutral term, spouse. But that's the only thing, nothing really to argue about, nothing to fight about, so that one you don't have to comment on. Senator Nichols. Right, but we do understand the importance of this. Because as if it is as a situation where there are more incidents of rape in this country, and we know for a fact that not all rape is being reported. So it means that we have some education to do with our people. It also means that we have some enforcement to do, especially with regard to abuse amongst children as well. So we need to empower the Child Care Board so that they have sufficient officers to go out there, that if there's any hint of child abuse, if there's any hint of grooming, that the appropriate response is made and that they're supported by the police service and all the other services. And if a principal at a school suspects that something like that is happening, that the appropriate resources are made. And it means, too, that we need to put more social services for our people, because oftentimes when we look at crime, we look at the offender, but we forget the victim. So we have to put more social services in place for the victim so that they can actually receive some sort of healing for the psychological stress that they were put under as a result of rape. for that child that went through abuse. The judicial system also needs to be fixed as well, because there's no way that a child that was abused at 9 should now be having the case heard at 21. All of these things we need to put in place so that these things are dealt with swiftly, because that is psychological abuse, and the way that the victim would feel is that nobody cares because they did not get justice in a timely manner for the abuse which was inflicted. So we don't just need to think about penalizing the offenders, but we also need to think about offering support to the victims as well. And that will bring about tremendous healing in this country and possibly help to bring down the crime wave that we are experiencing. Because it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening because there are a lot of social problems. So with those few words and the conquest to wrap, I thank you, Mr. President.
Speakers, Senator Nichols.
Mr. President, thank you for this opportunity to address the chamber on the bill under consideration. I know that the hour is late, but you would permit me the opportunity to make some comments about the importance of this bill and the context in which the government finds itself having to amend the legislation. Since 1992, the Sexual Offences Act has only been amended once. In 2016, the last administration amended the act to make provision for a charge to be brought against a man for raping his wife. And if I may just get straight into the rationale behind the use of the gender-neutral language in the current bill, it provides a better and more realistic legislative framing for perhaps one half of the relationships that we have in the country between men and women, because people in common law relationships would not have the benefit of the section or the amendment that came in 2016, because people who are living together for several years who have not gone to the church and got married, for all extent and purposes, are in a relationship. But those who are subject to rape will not have that benefit of the same protection that we afford. Yes, it will still be a rape, and it would not be a common law defense, but at the same time, we wanted to bring it on par in terms of the relationships between common law spouses and husbands and wives. The bill is also brought here as a result of a number of judicial decisions that have affected how the Sexual Offences Act has been interpreted by the courts. The language given by the lawgiver is subject to the interpretation of the courts as to what the law is. In 2022, our highest court confirmed that under the legislation, a man can in fact rape a man based on the language used in the text of the existing 1992 statute. The High Court judge in Barbados did not agree. The Court of Appeal came down on a split decision, and our final court, the Caribbean Court of Justice, looked at the proper interpretation of the act and the context in which the words were used, and found that a man could be charged for raping another man in Barbados. At the same time, the court found that the use of the gender-neutral language extended the definition to include rape, as rape, anal penetration as well. Any person, male or female, can be the offender or the victim of a rape. And this is an important step in terms of moving away from the English common law definition of rape. And the Caribbean Court of Justice, in my respectful view, was right to look at the language used by this Parliament as far back as 1992 to make that very progressive step in our law. Interestingly enough, Mr. President, the CCJ noted that there were a number of recent decisions challenging the offense under Section 9 of the present legislation which is the offense of buggery. And a number of Caribbean and other courts in the world have found that that offense, as was, I should say, structured and thing, was unconstitutional. And while they commented on it, they didn't rule on it because that was not a matter before our highest court. But they did echo the fact that they understood that there was a case before the courts. And in May of 2022, I believe, our High Court struck down Section 9 and Section 12 of the Sexual Offences Act. Section 9 provides for the offence of buggery, and Section 12 for the offence of serious indecency. These sections attempted to regulate the sexual activities between consenting adults in the privacy of their own homes, and thus were found to have violated the constitutional right to privacy, the constitutional right to liberty, to be able to be freely able to do in private what you think as an adult is your own course of enjoyment, and also violated the right to protection of the law, because Barbados is still a signatory of a number of international human rights treaties and conventions. And Mr. President, you will know that a number of Barbadians, styling themselves as the loyal opposition, brought a petition before the Inter-American Commission to challenge a bill that is on its way through the Parliament as a breach of the convention rights under the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights. I made the point because our highest court has determined that the state cannot ratify a treaty which gives fundamental, I should say, well, conventional human rights, rights under a convention, to obligate the state to abide by those rights, and at the same time have laws that undermine the efficacy of those rights. And that itself is a breach of your own constitution, because the constitution provides for a right to the protection of the law. So, insofar as Barbados was held to have, by the court, failed to meet our international obligations regulating the criminalization, or regarding, I should say, the criminalization of same-sex consensual acts between adults. Now, that case has prompted a lot of discussion in legal spheres, in academic spheres as well. Because while the case against buggery has been decisively determined all across the globe as being unconstitutional and a breach of people's constitutional rights, it was a court in Barbados that struck it down, and not this Parliament by way of amendment to the legislation. But more importantly, we have in that same case found that the offence of serious indecency, which was an English common law concept, which none of us can define what is serious indecency. And therefore, the vague nature of the language fell afoul of that important rule that a person must know that the conduct in which they are engaging is contrary to the law, and it is not meant to be subjective determination of the police that has brought the charge or the investigation. Mr. President, just very quickly, the bill does propose, I should say, not purport, because my expectation is that this bill should pass, a number of new sexual offenses. We are in an unhappy state where sexual offenses are prevalent in this society. Rape is given a more expansive treatment under this legislation. Sexual intercourse with another person without the consent, and consent is delineated in 7 different specific instances under the new legislation. It really creates for a more modern reading of the Act and accounts for a number of situations where judges will not now have to use creative means to address juries' concerns about whether a particular act should lack consent in the circumstances. There are cases where people who, where the courts have had difficulty in trying to address the jury's concerns about a woman who had sex because she felt that it was beneficial to her economically, and that was the only way that she could provide for her family. And whether or not that situation itself meant that she had the capacity to consent to the sexual act. What we have done in the legislation is now to delineate the circumstances in which consent is absent or can be deemed to be absent. This bill also proposes that sexual intercourse with a minor has always been something that is abhorrent in my view. But what we have now is offenses like the touching of a minor. No longer can the canteen assistant or the teacher or the groundsman touch a little child on their person, and then the Personnel Administration Division has difficulty in determining what to do in those circumstances. There are too many people who have been suspended from the public service for interfering with our children on leave with pay because the law is not clear. This no offense in this bill would address these things. And one of the things I would want to assure the public, Mr. President, is that when this bill is passed, it will not speak to incidents that have already occurred. But no longer will the gray area as to whether or not that is a serious sexual assault on a person because the law does not sufficiently speak to it in clear terms, these people will not get off anymore. Meeting a minor after sexual grooming. Not only sexual grooming, but meeting them is also now a specific offense. When I was at law school, the Ghanaians used to talk about fat fouling. We call it grooming. That is a more forensic term to use it. But in the Caribbean, they have other ways of describing it. The law of incest is revised. We have known incest in our society. And only recently, I was at a certain place and I was the last person to know of this within the context of a particular community. But it was not shocking, but still shocking to hear it. But we know, I mean, since I've had situations where we made fun of people in the community and say that John is James' Bronco. And as a society, we laugh at these things, you know? But now we have put more attention to how these provisions can be delineated. Sexual intercourse with your stepchild, adopted child, is not a crime, and rightly should be. Violation of a person suffering from mental disorder or physical disability is properly delineated as well, causing or inciting a minor to engage in sexual activity, even if the adult is not participating in that sexual activity. Engaging in sexual activity with a minor can create some challenges, particularly for people who live in very small accommodations where there are large families and so forth. But that is something that we have to protect, because teachers at the kindergarten level are complaining that little boys and girls at ages 4 and 5 are simulating what they are seeing in their homes at schools. They don't know any better, but that is what they're doing. And this is a troubling feature of how we are faced with these circumstances. I know that the level of moral culpability will differ from circumstance to circumstance, but it is still, in my view, Mr. President, sufficient to make it an offense under this new legislation. Mr. President, one of the more progressive features about the bill is that under the 1992 Act, we had this very strange provision tacked on at the very end of the bill, which provided that the court, in addition to any sentence or provision, could direct that if the accused is a man, he could be whipped. That is at the end of the bill, the present law in Barbados. And that, in my view, is barbaric. Happily, we do not whip people anymore in our society. Some people might say that is why the society is as it is, but I believe that we have a solemn, fundamental duty not to exact punishments that were exacted on our ancestors as a means to physically, mentally, and spiritually demean you. That is being abolished by the bill that we are passing. Also, an important feature of the bill, and I think I need to take the time to explain it, Mr. President, is that the hearing of evidence by a complainant is now to be done in camera, in other words, in private. No longer will the courtroom be packed with journalists, waiting jurors, members of the public, or anybody else, done in camera. For minor, it was mandatory before, but for adult, it was optional. The court had to make a determination. Notice had to be given to the accused person, and the court had to strike the balance between whether the evidence would offend public morality, public decency, and the effect on the complainant. I certainly participated in a sexual assault matter in which, after we broke on the afternoon, I got a note from a member of the public which was asking me to ask a question when we resumed the next day, which I thought would have been unfair to the complainant, even although I was representing the accused at the time. And I thought that that was really, really beyond the pale. But complainants now will not have to go through that process. And I would really like to think that the country can move to a stage where, particularly for young victims of sexual offenses, to record and take the evidence as early as possible so that the complainant does not have to go through that episode 2 and 3 times. It is very difficult. Earlier this week, Mr. President, I was drawn into a case where a lady at work was sexually harassed by physical touching. And while she was not the subject of the disciplinary proceedings in the workplace, she was made to feel that she was the victim or the reason why this is so. And the line of questioning from somebody that we all know well was that, why you didn't report it immediately? And that was the line, not that the man did it. And I want to say to you, Mr. President, and to Senator Worrell through you. Well, the last administration passed a sexual harassment legislation. I am yet to find a single incidence of the Employment Rights Tribunal doing a case under. I am aware that complaints have been made to the Chief Labor Officer and matters have been initiated, but not one single of these matters has ever come to my mind. I could be wrong, my research might be limited, but I'm not aware that a single case has ever come before the Employment Rights Tribunal for determination. And that is not because since the legislation has passed, people have stopped being harassed sexually in the workplace, but we have a culture of victim blaming in this society. We have a culture of not treating to these issues in a very serious way. And hopefully we can address these issues. Mr. President, I want to go very quickly into something that is important in my view, because we have had the reports coming out of the university studies and we are aware of the police statistics as it relates to sexual offenses in Barbados. There has been a call for a sexual offenses registry, which is designed to enable government authorities to keep track of the activities of persons who have been convicted of sexual offenses, including persons who have completed their sentences. The registration is accompanied by residential address notification. You have to notify where you live. And there are restrictions in jurisdictions where you can't live near schools or daycare centers or things of that sort. Some are more invasive. You can't even access the internet, depending on the nature of the sexual offense. Not many countries have these. From my research, Australia, Canada, UK, United States of America, South Africa, Republic of Ireland, and in the Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica have these registries. But what is interesting, what I discovered in my research, well, there has been a call, and I've heard it on the call-in programs a lot, I believe even Senator Walters may have spoken to it at some stage. I stand to be corrected, but or at least I heard it in this chamber coming from that side of the table. But what the research has indicated that a lot of the sexual offense registries are not really effective, because some of them are offense-based. As long as you have committed an offense under sexual offences legislation, you are placed on this registry. Some of them are risk-based assessments, so that if you are determined or deemed to have a propensity to commit this offense or a risk to reoffend, you will go on the register. But in most cases, it is an offense-based system. And many question the efficacy of it, because you're basically labeling a person a perpetual deviant, somebody who's to be shunned by the society. And the psychologists would tell you that is an early manifestation of what? The self-fulfilling prophecy. Likely to reoffend, because if the society thinks that you are a sexual deviant, then what could be more burdensome than going back up to prison for something that everybody thinks that I am? And that has been found to have been a troubling reality in relation to that. So as a small society, I know Trinidad has the legislation in place. They have notification requirements, and the police are to be notified everywhere you go. One deficiency you find is that in societies like ours, where we have a high level of deported people who are on sexual registries in the United States, UK, they come back. And Trinidad has found that, but the legislation does not provide for them to be registered or monitored in the way that they would have been in the country which they left. But Trinidad has now made their sexual offenses registered public, so people can be placed on it. But we don't have enough data coming out of the Trinidad experience, because they have only started that public register in 2019. Mr. President, the breadth of sexual offenses, and in this legislation we have a lot, should be some cause of concern if we were to go for a sexual offense register. Not all offenses carry the same level of moral culpability or public outrage. They can range from two minors experimenting and being caught, and then they face the criminal juvenile justice system. Do we put them on a register at age whatever? They're on it. It could be indecent exposure, or it could be something more dastardly like rape. It could be as nebulous as soft porn being exposed, children being exposed to it. So, do we lump all sexual offenses as a basis to put people on a register? We have, therefore, to look at that question of whether we should explore it. I know the Learned Attorney General has said it is a matter that is under consideration, and I believe that we should continue to look and evaluate the studies that have been done in other countries as it relates to these things. There is a number of studies coming out of the United States, because out of all the industrial countries, the United States is the only one that makes their register accessible to the public, whereas in the UK, Australia, Canada, and other jurisdictions, this register is only accessible to the police and to the state authorities that are in need of that kind of information as to the whereabouts, locations, and so forth of people. I suppose if you are planning to establish a school, you don't want a convicted pedophile or locate a school in the area where a convicted pedophile lives. Now that could be problematic in a small country like Barbados, because where you put them, and it is not a funny thing, because when we hear about the statistics about the prevalence of sexual violence, if we were to put a register in place, you could really have serious limiting impacts on the mobility of people in a small country like Barbados. And that itself as the studies have shown, can have its own reverse deleterious effects. So that we have a lot of work to do, and the legislation that we are passing today in the Senate will not solve this problem of sexual violence on our people, men, women, children, all subject to this. It makes better provision for the law, and we are modernizing the law in a significant way today. We have listened to the determinations of the court, and we have tried to keep the law lockstep with more progressive interpretations so that we can deal with the sexual violence in a modern contemporary framework. And the bill does, in my mind, achieve a lot of this. I can go into a lot more, because the bill does modernize the law in relation to corroboration, a number of different things. And time does not permit a full, exhaustive, detailed discussion as to how the law is modernized. But I do commend this to the chamber, and I wish to signal that it is really a step up, and the government should feel confident that the legislation no longer will face the judicial scrutiny of having imprecise, vague, outdated language that doesn't necessarily accord with how the courts will interpret criminal law and penal statutes, and it also does not offend the constitutional rights of our citizens. Mr. President, I'm obliged to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nichols. Senator Dr. Haynes.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. President. I just wanted 2 minutes quickly to speak to this important piece of legislation. As Senator Andwele would have spoken to earlier, we are in the middle of the 16 days of activism, and I think it's really important that we have committed to staying to this late hour to get this legislation passed. The opening lines in Law & Order SVU, that TV series, reminds us that the sexually based offenses are considered to be particularly heinous in the criminal justice system, if anybody remembers. And that's because the human body is the crime scene. And I just wanted to take 2 minutes to acknowledge the victims of these crimes and to acknowledge the important work that we're doing tonight to increase the scope of protections for all people, not just men and women, but gender minorities, people with disabilities. Because what we do know, as Senator Worrell, the leader of opposition business, would have spoken to, we're seeing an increase in sexual violence, but what we also know is that disproportionately, these acts are perpetrated against women, LGBTQ youth, people living with disabilities. And we can't take for granted that we're not here because of us, but because of the advocacy of civil society organizations that nobody's acknowledged to this point, Equals, ECAID, Butterfly, who brought a legal challenge to the constitutionality of 2 particular sections in the parent legislation. And it is that has triggered us being here. So I wanted to take the opportunity to recognize the important work of civil society in bringing us here tonight. And so I don't want us to wrap up tonight without that recognition, because it actually has given us an opportunity to make our laws better. And I think it's especially important on the eve of the 3rd anniversary of our transition into republic, a republic that's supposed to be a place where every single Barbadian has a place. So, Mr. President, with that very brief intervention, I'm obliged.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Haynes. Any other speakers? Senator Cummings, please write up.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to express appreciation to all of the honorable senators who have spoken on this bill. It is an important piece of legislation, and as we've heard from all of the honorable members who have spoken, clearly it is a societal issue and a wrong that is being righted. the opportunity to right the original wrong that went before the court, and then the opportunity to expand the scope of the amendments being made to the legislation. And that, Mr. President, is what we are here to do on any given day in service to people. And so, Mr. President, with those few words, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
I stood, Mr. President, to propose the appointment of an acting deputy president in the person of Senator the Honourable Lindell Nurse for the remainder of today's sitting.
The question is that Senator the Honourable Lindell Nurse be appointed Deputy Speaker for the remainder of today's, Deputy President for the remainder of today's sitting. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Nurse, thank you for agreeing to serve as Deputy President.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honour do now leave the chair and the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable the Senate resolve itself in a committee for further consideration of this bill. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Senate is in committee.
Mr. Deputy Pence, may we take the clauses in three parts? Clauses 1 to 10.
Mr. Deputy Chairman, I beg to move that that clauses 1 through 10 do not stand part.
The question is that clauses 1 to 10 do stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Clauses 11 to 20.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clauses 11 through 20 do not stand part.
The question is that clauses 11 through 20 do now stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Report.
21 to 23.
Oh, I'm sorry. Clauses 21 to 23.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that clauses 21 through 23 do now stand part.
The question is that clauses 21 to 23 do now stand part. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Sexual Offences Amendment Act of 2024.
The question is that this bill be now passed and be cited as the Sexual Offences Amendment Act 2024. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I think that this is a moment that all honourable senators have been waiting for me to say all evening. This brings us to the end of government's business for today's sitting. And I want to, again, as I started, I want to close and express appreciation to all honourable senators for literally just slugging it out from this morning through to tonight on the eve of independence. And I wish all of the honourable members, and wish all of Barbados a happy independence. I look forward to seeing everyone at the parade tomorrow as we celebrate our Independence Day. And so, Mr. President, I beg to move that the Senate is adjourned sine die.
Senator Worrell.
Mr. President, I would like to join the leader of government business in speaking on the adjournment and wish all Barbadians a happy 58th anniversary of independence, and also to thank the workers here at Parliament and the police service who also stayed with us throughout this. So make sure that tomorrow you get out there and enjoy your conkeys, and enjoy all the independence festivities.
Senators, please, senators, the business is not finished. Please, let us maintain due decorum. I know you're excited at the prospect of a little freedom in a few moments. Let me join with the leader of government business and with the leader of the opposition and the independent senators in wishing all of you, the staff and the general public in the hearing of our voice, on behalf of the entire Honourable Senate, wishing everyone a happy independence. I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow as we celebrate our 50th anniversary of our independence. I wish everyone a good weekend, and we look forward, Senator Cummings, when you will let us know when next you will have us here for a short while. So thank you very much, all the very best for independence, and thank you for such spirited and wonderful contributions today, notwithstanding the length of the day. The quality of your contributions did not wane as time went on. You've shown your intellectual and physical stamina. Thank you, well done. The question is that the Honourable Senate do now adjourn sine die. Will those honourable senators in favour please say aye? Aye. Those against please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. The Senate is adjourned sine die.